commonality between existing video essays on the philosophy of Bioshock is that they rarely go beyond the intrinsic philosophical connection of Ryan to Rand and the blame put upon him and or Objectivism for the fall of Rapture. As a wider philosophical study, therefore, I shall in this chapter run through some observations on the topic from other angles, hopefully providing some new insights on Bioshock. In consideration of the writer's intent, we can be almost certain that these ideas I'm about to present as applicable to Bioshock are purely coincidental, as the extent of their inspirations, as ascertained from interviews and behind-the-scenes documentation, were simply Rand's works for the philosophy, and for the theme, George Orwell's 1984 and Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. Books I will refrain from referencing further, as those comparisons have already been made by others. Any parallels, therefore, will merely be as a result of the following ideas' abilities to be widely applicable and explanatory of many human behaviours and systems, or perhaps somewhere upstream of Objectivism. Italian elite theory, developed by thinkers like Vilfredo Pareto, Gaetano Mosca, and Robert Michels, posits that societies are always ruled by a small, organised elite, even in supposedly democratic or hyper-individualist systems, maintaining power through coercion, persuasion, and manipulation of societal structures, while the masses remain knowingly passive or successfully manipulated. Whilst this is the case, a top-down implemented status quo or consensus emerges. The circulation of elites, however, is a mechanism where real change does happen, where one ruling group is eventually replaced by another, with the idea that power dynamics are driven by the elite's unique ability to adapt and to wield resources. Applying the theory to pre-Civil War Rapture, it begins in a relatively utopian state, with the objectivist ideals of individualism and free markets at the forefront. However, it quickly devolves into a society dominated by a small elite, consisting of Andrew Ryan, the Rapture Central Council, and eventually Frank Fontaine. Ryan represents the initial elite, enforcing his vision through charisma, propaganda, and control of Rapture's infrastructure. Although he's the paragon of society's shared ideology, he nonetheless retains the sole ability to decide in the state of exception, or state of emergency, and the sovereign is he who decides on the exception. His rule aligns with Mosca's concept of a political class that justifies its dominance through an ideology. Yet the circulation of elites emerges regardless, as Fontaine, a counter-elite, rises to power by exploiting the city's underclass and the addictive substance of Adam. Fontaine's method shows the difference between the two styles of elite power projection described by Pareto. In this case, the lions, overtly forceful rulers like Ryan, supplanted by foxes, Machiavellian subversives. The fall of Rapture, as a result of their competition, reflects the inherent instability of the ruling class, as described by elite theory. The elite's inherent pursuit of, or clinging to, power produced Ryan's creeping authoritarianism, Fontaine's criminal empire, and subsequent Adam addiction, all eroding the social order and trust from the masses they depended on. Though there were elites other than those two, by definition they were not as successful, and so became mere high-ranking tools of their struggle, never themselves usurping, but being usurped by power. This mechanism is explained by Michel's iron law of oligarchy, the inevitability of top elite rule even in utopian experiments or moments of revolution. The game's narrative and themes reveal the folly and fallen nature of man, how extreme people, ideologies and circumstances engender absolute disaster, how even stripped-back libertarian systems where its adherents share common goals are inherently flawed by their blind belief in man as a profoundly rational animal, capable of sufficiently passing objective reality and being good to one another without the need of an organised society, code of laws, or religion. It is a cautionary tale, not only about unfettered libertarianism, capitalism, individualism, or even objectivism per se, but about the necessity of an ordered society, the importance of recognising natural hierarchy, and the need to explicitly keep at bay the inevitable corruption that arises from unbound human nature, something which, as with all of nature, tends towards entropy, chaos, or, at the very least, rapidly accelerates the cycle of life. This force can become most apparent in such unnatural environments, such as Rapture, with its abundance, extremely competitive individualism, and closed environment. We can see this entropic force of nature as an immutable part of reality, which finally negates everything man-made, despite the best efforts of the greatest of man. Anything built not consciously conserved will be destroyed. The fast life strategy demonstrated in Rapture from the outset certainly correlated with the increase in degeneration and complete loss of a functioning society. It was something that was there from the start, but became maximised and totalised in everybody as the feedback loop became more rapid, with only Rapture's biggest names like Ryan and Fontaine able to keep to comparatively longer strategies, and by proof, last longer than the rest, with a better chance of their ideas or progeny living on. This life history theory view is one that can be applied psychologically, sociologically, financially, and biologically. In a Darwinian sense, the elective gene splicing that was going on with plasmids represented individual test cases, wherein every splicer had become addicted to evolution. The side effects of plasmid abuse and the intended genetic alteration maximised risk-taking, impulsiveness, and aggressiveness. If the residents of Rapture weren't riddled with psychopathologies before, they certainly were after that, all sanctioned by the tenets of Objectivism. Ryan's system as a faltering form of Objectivism is not even a pure capitalist paradise, but more a libertarian for thee, oligarchy going on monarchy for me situation, where most people were uncoerced by any sort of state, but power had nonetheless been pooled into hand-picked oligarchs, with the majority of power, of course, remaining in Ryan's hands. The Rapture Central Council is an example of this oligarchical grey zone. Initially comprised of Ryan's confidants, there was apparently a democratic mechanism for citizens to vote in new members, albeit this never amounted to any new councillors, and the elections were postponed several times in the months leading up to the Civil War, as Ryan's own directives became absolute. The council, or Ryan acting through it, had emergency powers to control individual citizens' assets, appropriate private companies, and issue arrest warrants. So maniacal had he become that by the end of the conflict, the other council members had either tried and failed to kill him, been killed by him, killed themselves, gone into hiding, or went insane. One particularly egregious example of a council member's demise was his assassination of Anna Culpepper. She was a singer who'd begun making songs that ridiculed Ryan, and the artist for whom he'd provided patronage, Sander Cohen. The supposed freedom of expression and the particular line that the artist should not fear the censor had been spitefully abandoned, with her assassination being justified by her opposition. All this, of course, directly contradicts the notion of a truly free market as the principle of life in Rapture, as Ryan manipulates its laws and suppresses competition when it threatens his own interests. It had been the apparent killing of Frank Fontaine and nationalisation of Fontaine Futuristics when Ryan accepted that Rapture, being his own creation, might as well mean anything within it was his as well, even if it's the work of other people. In responding to a growing competitor, as ill-intentioned as they may have been, Ryan became just what he had hoped to leave behind, an interventionist, and one just as malign as any government. The other irony being that the American government he had fled likely saw Ryan in just the same way as he saw Fontaine. Yet, the worst they did to him personally was attempt to nationalise his forest land. In this feud between competitors, Bioshock also inadvertently demonstrates John Nash's game theory, which posits that when individuals act purely in self-interest, without considering the broader impact of their actions, the entire system collapses. Ryan, who had a unique means to act, had inadvertently and then increasingly overtly unbalanced the equilibrium, with others doing the same as the outcome became inevitable. Another reason for the fall of Rapture was the ignorance of the necessity for an ordered and recognised hierarchy within society. Objectivism's rejection of organised society made any formal recognition of class impossible. This did not, however, stop it becoming clear that such splits in the Populists did exist. In contrast to this idea, Plato's philosopher king model suggests that the most enlightened and rational individuals should rule, being one to combine leadership, enterprise, and political and philosophical knowledge. Ryan could have been such a leader. Yet he neglected to recognise that role, and he also failed to account for the fact that a stable society requires not just visionary industrialists who create wonders, but also those who maintain them, the engineers, janitors, handymen, and so on. With the permanent presence of these people in Rapture, he had allowed in people who did not completely align with his ideals. It undermined his own society by ideologically ignoring the objective realities of it. Ultimately, his treatment of and unwillingness to settle with these people allowed for a malign actor to radicalise them against him and his system. The hierarchy was confused from the start, with Ryan at the top, torn between how and when to act on behalf of Rapture, the council beneath him, with other elites sometimes holding competing ideas, but not always the means to enact them, the initial wave of free citizens, and the growing underclass. For what was supposed to be a radically free society, an obvious hierarchy either had to be officially recognised and proper rules or moderations put in place, or submit entirely to some form of anarchy. Instead, each of the biggest characters abused their powers, often subversively, keeping up a facade of legitimacy. So, Rapture's descent into chaos illustrates that while libertarian-style ideals may reject the coercion of the state, it doesn't necessarily prevent a slip back into a state-like control, or, more destructively, into complete anarchy. If an individual with greater resources can use them to act in greed, so can a state, and vice versa. When such a process occurs regularly, it doesn't matter who or what is doing it, just that it is being done. A functioning society, therefore, must have a structured hierarchy that acknowledges both the over- and underclasses, as well as defining the function of its leadership, and the laws by which all obey. In Objectivism, therefore, it requires a moral framework beyond egoism, and an epistemological framework beyond mere rationality. Similar to libertarianism's almost tautological non-aggression principle, deeper and more realistic ideas exist that can be applied. Realistically too, one shouldn't be so naive to think that everyone in society can attain the status of Übermensch, one who transcends conventional morality to create and live according to his own values, unburdened by the sorrows of others and without the need of a god. Ryan himself is proof that no one man can live perfectly by his own set of principles, let alone a whole society. Ryan's desire to live among the elite represents a fundamental aspect of human nature, an innate preference for one's own group. People similar in genetics, culture, and so on are drawn close to each other than otherwise. Whilst some may place greater emphasis on certain group similarities than others, most people trend towards immediate family as their primary group preference, going outward with a lesser preference to community, nation, and world. The setup of Rapture, however, provided a peculiar and unnatural state for this ordering of preferences. For one, most of the residents were hand-picked or fit into some given requirement. This definitely selects for a certain type of person, but necessarily ignores whole other characteristics, being focused solely on ideological adherence and merit. This brought in people of exceptional or extreme outlier traits, whose disposition was towards a highly particular group preference, rejecting the rest of the world. Such a particular preference, it seems, can create bigger problems than if a slightly wider, more pragmatic approach was taken. Ryan only had to assemble a small city's worth of people, and yet the society they formed collapsed after just a decade. The initial objectivist system that prioritised singular preference for oneself was subverted with the creation of arbitrary groups such as the Council, which had a position of governance, and Atlas's underclass, who collectivised en masse for their common interests. So while Ryan sought to build a city of exceptional individuals, he overlooked the reality that societies function best when they acknowledge and enforce proper stratification based on certain metrics or characteristics. Thomas Carlyle's great man theory suggests that history is shaped by a select few, not by mass movements. Rapture was Ryan's to shape, but once another potentially great man came about, his ideals left him incredibly conflicted, while his opponent was not so bound. His hyper-individualism held him back from preferencing the existing working parts of society in Rapture over an individual miscreant until it was too late, when Atlas had already undermined them. Apart from Ryan's law against smuggling, it was the anarcho-capitalist ideal of a radically free market that had justified Atlas's exploitative business operations and barred organised resistance against him. This ideal, and a preference for other exceptional industrialist types, was exactly why Atlas had been invited to Rapture in the first place. Atlas, the revolutionary figure who claims to fight for the oppressed, represents the predatory element of many such movements, whatever they may be, but particularly pertinent here to the collectivist or populist types. Atlas exploits the discontented underclass, not to liberate them, but to seize power for himself. Needless to say, as proven by all history, this includes much bloodshed and doesn't end well for anybody. Most broadly, revolutions where supposedly popular ringleaders rally the masses under the guise of equality tend only to replace one form of tyranny with another. Whether that is what becomes of the leader themselves, or they create the vacuum of power, that inherently allows for such a type to come and fill it. The feeling of togetherness, strength in numbers, the utilitarian prioritising of the majority, and the assuredness of a singular representative figure lended your combined powers are proven aphrodisiacs for the masses. They are resultantly at the whim of the movement's leader, and are liable to disperse if they are removed without a suitable replacement. Rapture's conflict between objectivist individualism and collectivism can be understood through Hegelian dialectics, where each system serves as a thesis and antithesis, though, as we know, neither can sustain a society on its own. The synthesis could perhaps have acknowledged the role of enlightened self-interest, while maintaining the necessary societal hierarchy for people to interact through in a more regulated and group-conscious manner. There is a true dialectic here between Andrew Ryan and one Dr. Sophia Lamb, a clinical psychiatrist who he invites to provide counselling for the isolated populace. Whilst Ryan represents the objectivist thesis, Lamb proposes the entire antithetical mix of utilitarianism, altruism, and collectivism, making a point of the common good as opposed to the highest good being the self-interest of the individual. They had undertaken a series of public debates to argue their sides, with topics ranging from religious rights to the nature of reality. This publicity and Lamb's equally great rhetoric landed her a growing following called the Rapture family, who came to take her book, Unity and Metamorphosis, as a religious text, becoming far more cult-like than Ryan's adherents. Further comparison of these two can come about from Bioshock's sequel, where Lamb's philosophy is expanded upon, but for now I'll finish this segment with how Lamb was imprisoned by Ryan, posing a threat to the system, and how most of Rapture's citizens, for the duration of the first game's events, simply forget about her from that point on. Maslow's hierarchy of needs explains another failing of Rapture, the assumption that a society can function on high ideals alone, skipping physiological and psychological necessities and shooting straight for lofty self-actualization. Ryan envisioned Rapture as a haven for the great minds of the world, yet he and they ignored the basic needs of its people. Without any stabilising common infrastructure ensuring stability, the lofty ideal of freedom was undercut by a large enough portion of society reverting to striving just to meet primal needs. The inevitable outcome was that the symbiotic relationship between the emergent producer and consumer classes breaking down undermined all cohesion. The forming of a distinctly identifiable or self-identifying working class was not the cause of, but the product of the ideology's failure. Once society-wide ideological purity disappeared, downfall became imminent. So the free market ultimately did not produce the best outcomes for the most people. Obviously this is not the stated goal of such a system, where the idea of fairness is everyone having an equal start rather than an equal outcome. The issue, however, is that early citizens of Rapture, those handpicked by Ryan, often with the most wealth upon entering the city, were able to corner certain markets until demand was met, creating monopolies. This became even worse when smuggling became an arrestable offence, as the opportunity for newcomers to access the global market became illegal, not that it stopped the likes of Fontaine. Two examples of seemingly monopolised sectors of the market were the desalination of seawater to produce drinkable water and the production of breathable air by trees and plants. Air and water being two necessities of life, and difficult if not expensive to produce at the bottom of the ocean, meant that there would be a guaranteed and indefinite demand for such things as products, meaning that whoever controlled the production of these resources would be guaranteed crazy profits and potentially command much power. If the sources of air or water were held as ransom by their owners, then there would be little that could be done by the individual consumer but comply with price hikes or otherwise take over or nationalise them, which would of course go against the principles of Rapture. The only condoned response would be for an individual or voluntary, mutually beneficial collaboration to compete against and break the monopoly, thereby rebalancing the market. Though commodified, neither are ransomed for profit maximisation during Rapture's heyday. Only after the Civil War does Ryan himself attempt to burn down the oxygen-producing plant life as an attempt to asphyxiate and kill the player, at least proving that such a danger of monopoly had been present. Bioshock's plasmid serves as a metaphor for unregulated technological progress. The discovery and harvesting of Adam from sea slugs is an irony in that these, as Ryan would say, parasitic creatures indeed accelerated its fall. At once an opportunity of capital gain, just a product to be sold, its most cost-effective production method was simply evil in the use of those little sisters. Also, and being weaponizable, it was further developed to those ends alongside an escalating conflict, instead of being developed for safe commercial or perhaps medicinal uses. Proliferation of plasmids mirror real-world drug markets, where dangerous strains are developed of increasingly addictive substances whose cost and supply is controlled by criminals. This harms particular individuals and classes more than others, but affects whole societies by allowing rampant vice and addiction. Though we have distinctions between legal and illegal drugs, many legal types are nonetheless abused and can be lethal too. In fact, legalized drugs can produce greater profit for more people as they become widely distributed on the open market, and allows for the state to tax sales, spend less on policing the product, and control said distribution themselves. While unbounded innovation may drive incredible discoveries and developments, technology and the products of it are never neutral. Take for example atomic science. It can be used to cleanly generate vast amounts of electricity, or it can be used for powerful bombs. So-called technological progress must therefore be tempered by ethical considerations in the form of regulatory oversight to prevent misuse or exploitation of people. This necessitates some sort of body within the state that has the mandate to enforce such restrictions. The ideological absolutism against this accelerated the collapse of Rapture society and shows that the absolute freedom, especially in matters as extreme as genetic modification, leads to exploitation, degeneracy, and complete societal decay. Another key failure of Objectivism is its neglect of the role of family and generational continuity. Rand never wrote extensively about children, nor did she emphasise their obvious importance in sustaining a society. Similarly, in the first Bioshock game, Ryan's Rapture had no long-term vision for future generations, which would have contributed to a slow but inevitable decay regardless of the Civil War. Even worse was the exploiting of the city's orphans with the abductions and turning them into the Adam-harvesting little sisters, in this way the old are eating the young, like Saturn devouring his son. This immoral outcome thanks to Rand's blind spot as to how you treat certain people within the frame of Objectivism. Those who have not got full agency or lack the ability to fend for themselves, such as children, the disabled or infirm. A lot of Objectivism's assertions rely on the ability of free agents to engage rationally with one another and bargain in favour of their wants, without any necessity to give without receiving. This principle is antithetical to the natural process of child rearing though, where for many years of a child's life, it is completely dependent on their parents' work, love and attention. The family unit is also a barely explored phenomenon, which also rubs against the core of Objectivism. The benefit a family provides itself and a community, the joint wealth it can accrue to purchase property, is disregarded in favour of treating its members as individuals and delegating almost contractual obligations to the parents. But any successful society, civilization, indeed any ideology, must make a point of investing strongly in its progeny, reinforcing values and ensuring continuity. It cannot be an afterthought. Rapture can be seen as an experiment in social contract theory, the conception of an unsigned agreement between people to form and partake in a society. Thomas Hobbes argued that man chose to enter society to escape the chaos of the state of nature and to ensure some level of security despite losing some personal freedoms. Opposingly, Jean-Jacques Rousseau believed man was shackled by society and longed to return to the absolute freedom of nature and the supposed abundance and opportunities there. Rapture indeed was built as an escape from the shackles of government control, seeming to be a test of Rousseau's vision for man's relative return to nature. Yet, its citizens, free to indulge in any vice, ultimately descended into a brutal state of nature, exactly as described by Hobbes, proving that absolute liberty without order results in total decay. Bioshock does not just critique Objectivism, but exposes the failure of any ideology that does not account for the complexities of human nature. Letting people loose as individuals from their infinite egotistical agency begs a kind of anarchy and proliferation of power struggles that is just the flip side of the coin as a state forcing people to act entirely for others and the false ideal of altruism. A functional society must balance individual ambition with social responsibility, innovation with regulation, freedom and order, state and citizen, ruler and ruled. Much as Ayn Rand's close group of objectivists, the Collective, had fallen apart under her own internal contradictions, Andrew Ryan's dream of Rapture was doomed by his own ideological blindness to these fundamental truths. Despite claiming to be a direct realist, Rand's absolute dismissal of pragmatism forbade this kind of interaction with the world as it is, not as it ought to be. We must recognise, of course, that the setting of the game is designed to represent an already collapsed dystopian society to tell a dark story, provide players an evocative setting, and facilitate the shooter gameplay. For that, the writers destined Rapture to fail, and any insights into objectivism are drawn backwards from the terrible outcomes witnessed by the player and are documented through audio diaries. More than a critique on objectivism, as I've said, the writers provide an interesting and entertaining exploration of human nature and dogma, especially if you consider Andrew Ryan to be a dramatised character study of Ayn Rand, if perhaps you've been given a city to run. The intention of Bioshock then is not to cast the philosophy as inherently evil or even infeasible. We were fairly presented Andrew Ryan's vision at the very start of the game, and are shown in his final moments how he at least still is assured of his beliefs, despite having personally faltered. From an interview with the game's director Ken Levine, he said, "It's not an attack on objectivism, it's a fair look at humanity. We screw things up. We're very fallible. What happens when reality meets the ideals? It could have been objectivism, it could have been anything." To be fair to Levine's depiction of an objectivist Failtopia, the scenarios which are presented within Rand's own works have the same meta-problem, only in reverse. Her hero protagonists are ultimately fated to win or prove her right, and the antagonists thereby lose or are proven wrong and evil. Much like Ryan at his end, Rand would never have admitted any imperfection in her philosophy. She believed it dogmatically to a fault, even when acting hypocritically. Objectivism, it seems, is best suited only as a personally practiced philosophy within a system that allows for individuals to do so, as described earlier, a formula. There are many missing pieces, grand assumptions, and likely unscalable assertions. It simply isn't a complete philosophy, and indeed has never been tried on much of a scale. The Collective were themselves the furthest experiment in objectivist living, yet it was the progenitor of the idea herself that broke them apart, with her rational self-interest no less, unintentionally proving a fatal flaw in the philosophy, the nature of man, wanton jealousy, disparity in subjectiveness of so-called rationality, group power dynamics, and the inevitable self-sorting of hierarchy. What scant morals and virtues were prescribed absolutely came after the desires of the individual. As Andrew Ryan uses metaphor, the great chain that holds people together only does so when everyone is pulling it. Perhaps, though, the great irony shared by both of our subjects is that they escaped one extreme collective circumstance and ended up creating their own personal or micro-collectively extreme circumstance instead. The spectre of ideology had cursed them both from the start, something their free wills could not escape. To be fair though, like the Collective's early days, Rapture's initial success proved some of the ideology could, and the original group were fully brought into the idea, the majority of society being successful as a result. In Bioshock Infinite's Burial at Sea DLC, set back in Rapture's heyday before the Civil War, we get to hear many of the citizens having discussions in terms of objectivist philosophy.
Edward thinks the way to my heart is philosophical transcendence. He's brilliant. If I wanted brilliant, I'd go to bed with a book.
You're just trapped by petite bourgeois notions of romance, aren't you?
Compromise? Is that why we came to Rapture? I could compromise in Red Hook.
We're just men and women, Alan. You hold yourself to that standard, you'll never be happy.
In what country is there a place for men like me? Men who refuse to say yes to the doubters and the parasites. Sexual intimacy is no different than any other commodity, friend. You sell soybeans, I sell companionship.
Ugh, it's disgusting.
That's the Bible talking, pal. That's your mother talking. What does Ryan say? Petty morality? You can keep it.
Back in the first Bioshock, set entirely after the Civil War, those citizens have now become the splicers used by Ryan, continuing to babble objectivist creeds in their crazed state.
A man could start a business down here, yeah. No, it's not too late. It's just a bad quarter. No, that's all. Yeah, market will come back, huh? Yeah, everything will be fine.
Somebody's got to keep order around this place. If not, it'll go to the parasites. All these parasites want a piece of this place. And we got to defend what's ours.
After the societal schism and ensuing disasters, the only remaining ideological adherents were Ryan himself and the mindless, murderous cultists. Several important characters, however, each now at odds with Ryan, do not remain as proponents of the ideology at all. Rather, they've all either revealed or pragmatically taken on a realist, oppositional, or non-ideological frame, given the dire circumstances they're in. Atlas/Fontaine remain the driven, antagonistic force, whose altruism towards the underclass is of course a charade, his goal simply to take down Ryan and assume control of the city. The other side of the coin to Ryan, Atlas's egoism does not extend to others. He embodies pure selfishness, without any of the limiting factors which Objectivism relies upon. Tenenbaum, who, while working under Fontaine and later Ryan, could at once be described as unempathetic at best, or otherwise completely morally disengaged, is now the opposite, characterised instead by her empathy for the Little Sisters, who she helped create, personifying the process of redemption. Her only goal is to save as many as possible and get them out of Rapture. These characters, and others, serve as their antitheses to Ryan and his project. For us, there are arguments to be made against his assumptions, and their ongoing presence taken as proof they are indeed valid points. What to do when people's ambition overtakes their compassion and hurts others when there is no state to punish them? How can man alone be trusted? Bioshock and its two sequels are all about ideologies taken to the extreme, implemented and enforced with inexorable regard, with antagonists who are the personification of radical ideologues. There are hidden meanings and deep themes outside of philosophy as well that provide a meta-commentary on agency, abuse, what constitutes a family, as well as reoccurrences of imperfect and dogmatic people turning utopia to dystopia. In trying to keep the Bioshock 1's videos' length down, I haven't commented much upon these, as story explanations would be too burdensome. Likewise, there are hours worth of observations more to be made from the philosophical and other points of view, but hopefully this video serves as an introduction to Objectivism, to Bioshock, as well as some critiques from within its narrative. I intend to produce similar videos, each on Bioshock 2 and Infinite, where I'll also embark on some wider discussions. Till then, thank you for watching.